All right. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the Chapter 1 webinar, Statistic Solutions. Just to let everybody know, we do have another person on the presentation with us who will answer your non-content related questions. For any content related questions as we proceed, you can type them into the chat box. That's fine, but I won't get to them until the end. Okay, let's get started. So the Chapter 1. The first thing I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to reiterate it several times throughout the presentation, is get your school's template. Find out what your school requires in terms of Chapter 1, in terms of all the chapters really. But you shouldn't be flying blind. Get your school's template. Ask your chair for a template if you're having trouble locating it on your school's website or anything. Just see if they have something they want you to follow. If they don't, sometimes schools don't have a template. You can use a general template, and we have some of those on our website. And this Chapter 1 is based on a general template that contains features that are common to Chapter 1. But sometimes schools will have particulars, so that's why I encourage always sticking with your school's template. Also, getting a hold of an example that your chair can recommend, or an example of a dissertation from your school in a similar area, that also helps, because you can talk about ideas and strategies and what goes into certain sections. But when you sit down to write, it can be a challenge, and sometimes concrete examples of what people have done are very helpful. Okay, so Chapter 1. Typically, Chapter 1, most social studies dissertations, is the introduction. And the introduction think of the introduction as the blueprint for your study. It's going to tell the reader what you're doing, how you're doing it, the design, the method, and why you're doing it, right? The reason, the research question, research problems driving the study. So what, how, and why. And it's going to be kind of a blueprint for those things and what you're doing in the study. These are the typical features of the introduction chapter. Again, schools may have little differences, but this is the basics. All right. So it goes into the introduction of the introduction chapter. It's introducing the chapter, but it's also introducing your study. So you want to start with what the problem is. Usually there's some kind of organizational problem or a social problem. It could be say the attrition of special education teachers, right? So that's an organizational problem, a problem for education. Introduce your topic, introduce why it's a topic, maybe use some recent numbers, right, to grab your reader's attention, to show that it's a problem. Stay as recent as possible here, because you want to show that it's a problem now. It's something that was a problem 20 years ago, may not be a problem now. Then the second part is there's likely been research done on this topic or this problem. So you want to kind of, in quick terms, again, this is the introduction. You're going to go into all this more in depth as the chapter goes on, but talk about the research problem, right? So there has been research on this topic, on this problem, and just recap kind of quickly what we know, right, from that research. That will then, help you to highlight what is not known, right, or the research gap. So that's where your study is designed to come into, is to address the research problem or the research gap. State what is needed to address the research problem, a study designed to whatever your study is going to do. And just, in the section by why you're, by stating why your study is needed, based on the problem, based on the research that's been conducted, and based on what's still needed. And so when you end the section, again, you're going to flesh all this stuff out later, but your reader should understand what your topic is and why you're conducting your study. You can also end this section, if you want to, with a preview of the sections of the chapter that follow. So there should be no questions. Your reader shouldn't be scratching their head as they move, on to the next section. Okay, the background section is usually next, and this is where you can kind of get into more depth about the research that's been conducted on the topic, what the problem is, where the problem comes from. Right, so it's a little bit historical. You don't want to spend a lot of time in the history of the problem, though, or in the history of the research. Kind of use broad strokes there. You want to kind of give a sense of where the problem came from and where it's been and where it is now. But, you don't need to get into great kind of detail. What are the trends? What are the trends in the problem? How have people addressed it? What's the trends in the research? So you're giving kind of a broad strokes overview of the problem and where it's been, and the research, more importantly, really the research on the problem, right? Because this research that's been done, it's going to show you what's been done. But again, the point is to show us what's not been done, or maybe that the approaches that researchers have taken haven't worked, or they've only given us certain kinds of information, but we also need this other kind of information. So that's what the research problem is. The research problem is some kind of problem or issue in the research that needs to be addressed. So the problem may be a gap. It may not be a gap. It may be, again, that all the research we have on this phenomenon is quantitative. Well, we need some qualitative research. So this is building the background to kind of what is lacking, or what if the issue is in the research, your research problem. Okay, and then you get to a section called the research problem, and this is where you kind of clearly lay out what the research problem is based on the background that you just provided. So it transitions into the research problem. You can talk more in a more targeted fashion about what the specific research on your topic has shown, and how it has come really to the present condition that it's in, which again includes the research issue or the research problem or the gap that is the basis of your study. And the research problem is important. Fundamentally, it's probably the most important component of your study because it drives the whole study. In other words, it is the reason that you're conducting your study. Okay, next usually comes a section called the purpose. And the purpose is, it needs to be stated very specifically. And I've given you examples here, and this usually works across schools. But again, if your school has a specific way they want it worded, follow that. But this seems to me to be pretty universal. The purpose of this approach, design, meaning the purpose of this correlational, quantitative, or it would be quantitative correlational study. So whatever it is, if it's qualitative, whatever the design is, qualitative phenomenological study, okay, is to examine, explore. Usually terms like examine, investigate are typically associated with quantitative studies. Not necessarily, but the word explore almost always is associated with qualitative studies. Is to examine, explore, investigate, and then this is where you would have your variables or your concepts that you're looking at. and then you would have your particular sample or setting. So I've given you a couple examples here. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence in, teachers in Southwestern schools, high school level, whatever your particular setting and your particular participants are. So that's the purpose statement. And what the purpose statement is, it's really an encapsulation of what you're doing in your study. It doesn't tell you why, but it tells you what kind of study it is. It tells you the design. It tells the variables. So it's kind of your study in a nutshell. The section, it's typically not too long. It may include more specific information about your variables, how you're defining your variables. It may have information about your instruments. But usually you don't go into a lot of depth about that. That comes in the methodology section later, but it may have need to include information about those things. Okay, the research questions usually come next. And this webinar focuses really on the non-methodological sections of the chapter. So I'm not going to go into depth about developing research questions, but we do run webinars on methodology, which would include developing research questions. So if you're interested in that specifically, or the next section, which is called, or the nature of the study, tune into a methodology webinar. Okay, so you would state the research questions here. And then usually comes your theoretical framework, or sometimes called conceptual framework. And I got the same question all the time is, should I say theoretical framework or should I say conceptual framework? And what's the difference? And there's some overlap here and things get a little gray, but really the most important point for us to remember, to take away, is that theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. I've read a lot about it and I've listened to different arguments. And what I can kind of surmise is that for theoretical frameworks, sometimes for quantitative studies, sometimes a theory will kind of cover what you're doing, what you're looking at. So you can use a theory or two if you have to, and call it a theoretical framework. Sometimes for qualitative studies, there may not be a theory. You may be exploring a topic or exploring a phenomenon. And you have to use concepts or several concepts and kind of put them together to make a conceptual framework. That's kind of the distinction as I see it. It's really not important to kind of to grasp the distinctions if we can, but just to know that the theoretical for quantitative, conceptual for qualitative. Let's see, theoretical or conceptual. Okay, so what you want to do for this section is just come out and say at the beginning, whatever it is, social exchange theory will serve as a theoretical framework for the study. You have a citation for it, a date for the citation for the theory. You want to define the theory, right? Clearly define the theory as you'll be using it in your study. Define any components to it that are relevant to your study. Mention who developed it. Talk a little bit about what the person developed it for, to explain. And theories, what do theories do? Theories help us explain stuff. So talk a little bit about the person who developed, what they developed it for. What have researchers used it for in the past? Is it a well-used theory, a well-known theory that helps to your reader understand that it's something that's probably suitable for what you're doing. And then you need to talk a little bit about how it connects to your study, which can be tricky, but let's say you're doing a quantitative study on emotional intelligence. Okay, so there's a theory of emotional intelligence, right? There's probably a couple. But if you're using a specific instrument, because that instrument measures the types of things that you're covering in your study, you want to go with that person's theory for your study. In other words, let me put that a different way if that's not clear. Emotional intelligence, we have a couple theories. We have Goleman's theory and we have Smith's theory. Goleman has his own instrument, Smith has her own instrument. If you're using Smith's instrument to study emotional intelligence, then you want to use Smith's kind of theoretical basis, not Goleman's. So you don't want to kind of mismatch instruments and theories, because all instruments and surveys and tools they have a theoretical basis. So you want to go with whoever the researcher concept of the theory, whose instrument you're using. Okay. And the theoretical framework is, people struggle with it. It's just one of those things you just have to kind of read about, attend webinars, see how people have handled it in previous, in examples and other studies as examples. But I will say this too, is that when it comes to your theoretical framework, simpler is better. And that doesn't mean simple in the terms of basic, it just means simple in the term of streamlined, and just what's necessary and fundamental to your study. Because the more theories, people think they need to add several theories. I'm going to use this, and this, and it's okay, that's great. Well, now you need to attach 3 theories as opposed to 1 to what you're doing, which can be tricky just for one theory. Then ideally in chapter 5, you should talk about your results in relation to your theory. So then now if you have 3 theories, you're going to have to talk about, 3 theories in connection to your results. So, I mean, more theories, and it's not to say to stay away from, just because there's more, but it complexifies things. The more streamlined your study can be in this way, the better. One well-suited theory is usually all you need. Sometimes you may need more, but 2, 3, I don't ever see why you would need more than 3 theories, and usually not even that. Okay, I see the question. I'll get to it at the end. Okay, next section, nature of the study or the study design. There's usually going to be a methodology section in chapter 1. And again, this is not a methodological webinar, so I'm not going to cover this. We do run webinars on the methodology sections if you want to attend one of those. But this would be the section where you would describe your methodology, your design, and usually some kind of rationale for why you've picked a design. Okay, definitions. Always a section called definitions, because this clearly lets you put down what the concepts and the variables in your study mean as they pertain to your study, right? So what do you include in this? Usually, definitely your variables, any factors or variables, those would be included. And any kind of major concepts, like for qualitative, the major concepts and major areas you're studying. You just need to define your terms, right? If you're studying teaching effectiveness, right? Well, people, teaching effectiveness can be defined different ways. It can be defined as based on grades, or it could be defined based on, a scale, which involves people's perceptions. So, for your study, how are you defining teacher effectiveness? Okay, so definitions should be in the form of sentences. They need to be clear and succinct. This is not a place these are not discussions, right? There are many definitions of teacher effectiveness, and we don't care. That's maybe chapter 2 material, but for the definitions, it's just a clear and succinct definition of the term or the variable or as you're using it. So teacher effectiveness will refer to, that's how you should start all of them. Such and such is, or such and such will refer to. Usually a sentence covers it, maybe 2. Again, they're clear, succinct definitions, not discussions. Ideally, they should be supported with a peer-reviewed source. No dictionary definitions, no dictionary citations. Okay, these are not general definitions pulled from Webster's. Sources should be recent when possible, but for the definitions part, that's not so important. Just a peer-reviewed source is what's important. Significance, there's usually a section called significance or something like it. Sometimes maybe it's called implications. And usually this has 2 prongs to it. So there's the research implications or the significance to research, and the practical implications or the implications or the significance to practice. So, you're conducting the study for a reason, to get information. Then how can that information be used? How can it be significant to somebody? And again, two prongs. So for research, how is it? And you don't know yet because you haven't conducted your study. So this is kind of projecting in the sense of, well, my study, the findings may be significant to research. And you discuss that, like what is it going to add to the research? That's what they're looking for. How might your study contribute to the research on the topic? What can it add? Can it alter our thinking? Might it, change the way we think about something or approach something or research something? Does it have, the potential to kind of modify the way we think about a theory? And the other part is, how does it inform practice? Same thing, but for practitioners, right? Whoever, if you're doing an education study, what might your study mean for teachers? What might it mean for administrators? What does it mean at that kind of nuts and bolts level for people in the area doing the work? Okay, and some schools, I think Walden is one of them, has a third kind of aspect to it, which is positive social change. And again, that's usually one school, and usually they want you to say something, well, how will this kind of contribute to overall, positive social change? And usually if you're improving somebody's life, through some way, or, helping them understand something where they can get raises or the better grades or something, that usually has like social implications too. Okay. Other section, I've kind of lumped these together because while some schools have these, some schools don't. But usually they want you somewhere to talk about potential limitations. So this means anything that you could see that might act as, that get in the way of your study, that might affect your findings, like any kind of weaknesses or shortcomings. Sometimes, people have trouble getting enough participants for their study, which can become a problem for quantitative studies, because it means your study will be underpowered statistically. So any kind of things you see, some typical kind of potential limitations, especially for qualitative research, would be researcher bias, being too close to it, not being objective. And there's methods that you can use to kind of help minimize researcher bias. But you would want to mention some of these potential limitations here. Doesn't need to be a long section, but they want to know that you're thinking about, down the road that things that could come up and create problems. Assumptions, and these are really good sections actually that other people's examples will help you with, because sometimes you read the description, you're just scratching your head like, I don't know what they mean. Assumptions, these are things that fall outside of your control as a researcher, so you just have to assume them. And again, it's not a long section, but some schools require it. So one of the big assumptions is that you can't control people and what they say. So you just have to assume that they are going to be honest with you and tell you the truth and answer to the best of their abilities. There's another section called delimitations. And I know it's confusing because it has the word limitations in it, and we already have a section called limitations. So if it helps you, just think of this section as being called scope. This is really the scope of your study. So, if you ever watch a movie and you look at, they show the picture of somebody looking through like a periscope or binoculars. I mean, think of it that way. What's in that field of vision, that's what's in your study. That's what's in the scope of your study. And so it really just kind of defines the parameters of your study. And it sounds a lot like your participants in your setting. You will be focusing on, this set of teachers in this area. And it's just kind of reinforcing the parameters of your study. And again, it's real helpful to look at examples with this one. And again, some schools don't require these. So another reason to check your school template. And then the summary. And like any summary, recap the major points of the chapter. And you don't want to give a fake summary. And what I say about a fake summary is sometimes people like to go, well, I did this in this chapter, and I said this, and I did this, and I did that. And they just give a little list of what they talked about. And that's what I call a fake summary. A summary, it kind of goes back, it doesn't go into it, obviously, it's a summary, but it kind of recaps the major points for the reader. Remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed and important. And you can end the study by transitioning to the next chapter, like what the next chapter is and will include, if you wanted to do that. Okay. This is our contact information, and I know I have questions I'll get to in a minute. And everybody these are posted on our website, but also everybody should be receiving a copy of the presentation. So let me get to the questions. I have one here. Specifically, what is the difference of theoretical and conceptual framework? As you said, that conceptual framework is for qualitative. Is it possible to use the conceptual framework for quantitative study? Can you switch the terms around? I mean, I guess, but if you're just switching the terms, I don't see where it really matters. Those are the terms that are typically associated with each type of study, with each approach. If your chair, your school wants you to call it one over another, I've seen that happen. They don't want one term used for some reason and just use the other one. That's fine. I wouldn't get too caught up in the distinctions. Just knowing that you need a study to help, a theory or a framework, it can be a conceptual framework. Again, a couple concepts that you kind of put together to create a framework. You need a theory or a conceptual framework to help guide your study and to help explain the results. So that's what they're for. What are examples of limitations for qualitative research that might be worth remembering? Yeah, one I think I mentioned was for qualitative research, one is always researcher bias, subjectivity bias. And if you put that, in there, you might want to talk a little bit about, define the researcher bias. And then there's several ways you might want to research this too. There's several ways to kind of prevent or help mitigate researcher bias, where you there's something called bracketing, where you kind of bracket off your own preconceived notions about the topic and set them aside, and approach things as a researcher, but with more objectivity. So if you do bring up something like researcher bias, just have mention a couple or one or a couple ways that you might use to help mitigate that bias. Yeah, and another thing, sometimes people might not be able to get the population they want to get. It may be kind of iffy, so they have to use a proxy population. There's things like that can crop up. What does it mean to have potential generalizability of results in the scope? Okay, this is a good question. I'm glad you brought up generalizability, because I forgot to. And it's not in the scope really. It's it can be in one of these sections. It can be in the limitations. It might appear in the scope, but so generalizability is the idea that you're doing a study on a sample of a larger population. You're doing you're studying job satisfaction in elementary school teachers. Okay, so your larger population is elementary school teachers, and you're just studying a sample of them. So the idea of generalizability is how well your results will generalize to the larger sample population, how well it will generalize to other elementary school teachers. Usually, and that depends on things like your sampling. Like if you do like random sampling, that helps increase your generalizability. For quantitative studies, you're getting the adequate number of people for your sample matters. So if your study has too few people, it's underpowered. So that means your sample was too small, and your the ability of your results to generalize to the larger sample population is reduced. If you statistically, like you met the number of people that you needed and went above it, your generalizability was probably be pretty good, because you did meet that statistical threshold for, they call G power. So that's what generalizability is. For qualitative studies, generalizability is not the goal. So you can mention it for your qualitative study that the results probably won't generalize well, but they're not designed to. Qualitative studies are designed to get in-depth information that you can only get with, like interviewing 8 people, right? Quantitative studies can't do that. They can't get that kind of depth of information. So qualitative studies aren't really designed to give you generalizable information. They're designed to give you deep, specific information. But you can mention that in kind of those terms. The important thing about qualitative studies in this regard is something called transferability. So, do you have enough information about how you conducted your study that if somebody wanted to replicate it, they could replicate it and come up with similar answers? That's called transferability, which is different than generalizability. And that would apply to qualitative studies. Okay, how can we prepare a precise problem statement? Could you illustrate a little bit by details? No, I can't. I don't have the resources right here to do that, because it involves. I can for future. I may be able to. I'll pull a sample of a good research problem. because it involves very specific information about going into the research on your topic to see what people have done, to also to see where the areas are that are lacking, to see what people are recommending. You could also look at that too. You know, researchers will recommend we need more research in this area on this topic. So yeah, it's a little bit outside of what I can do right here to kind of go into the specifics of it. But I will say this as a metaphor, this helps me think about the research problem, and I don't know if it will help you, but as a metaphor, if you need a metaphor, think of a donut hole, right? So if you had to, you can't explain a donut hole because the hole doesn't exist. It's a gap in space. So what you need to do is to describe the donut, right? And thereby describing the donut, you know, you you get a sense of the space that's in the middle. That's kind of like a research problem. You have to describe the donut that is the research that exists around the problem to kind of zero in on the gap or the problem. And I know that's not what you asked for the details, but again, the details, I'm not set up to kind of go into it at that level. Here's an article I found about theory, theoretical framework, and conceptual framework. Yeah, good, great, thank you. Yeah, and there are resources out there. You know, I mean, I'm sure you all know. I mean, you go through your, you know, Google Scholar, go through your university library. There are, you know, type it, search theoretical framework, search the difference between theoretical framework and conceptual framework. There's research out there, there's articles out there. So that is yet another, yes, thank you for posting that. That's yet another resource at your fingertips. Great, okay, good. And let's see, I have one over here, another. In which part of the introduction can we define the variable? The variables would be defined in the, well, they would be defined in the definition section, but they would also be talked a lot more, you would talk more about them in the methodology sections. Obviously, any variables would be defined in the definition section. And in the nature of the study section or in the study design, you would definitely talk more about your variables in those sections. Okay, anything else? I think I've covered everything on my list. Okay. The introduction chapter, how many pages should it be? How many citations should we have? You know, schools may or may not have page length requirements. If they do, obviously follow those. You know, it varies, and I'm going to say, you know, anywhere from 10 to 20 pages. You know, probably the sweet spot being 12 to 15 pages. How many citations? Sometimes your lit review, your school will require a certain number of citations, but I've never seen a required number of citations for chapters other than that. So, you know, I don't know, however many it takes. Obviously, it's, you know, it's advanced academic writing, and it's, you know, a lot of things that you say are going to need citations, right? They don't want assertions or statements that, you know, that seem to be opinions or that seem to have no basis to them. But there's no requirement on the exact number. Okay, anything else? And yeah, circling back to that research problem question, maybe we can, just thinking either do an entire webinar on the research problem, or kind of build in a little, a little section where we can go into more depth in these. So thank you for asking about that. All right, great, everybody. Well, thank you for attending. I'm going to let you go. And if you have questions, you want to talk to somebody about what we offer, and if that's right for you, just that you have our contact information, just give us a call or send us an email. All right, thank you, everybody, and good luck.